Welcome back, you thoughtful listeners, to Reformed Thinking, where we consider the timeless truths of God's Word and how they shape our world.
It's good to be back.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into something truly, well, compelling. We often think of national security as purely a matter of hardware, budgets, strategic alliances, that kind of thing.
Standard stuff, yeah.
But what if a nation's post-war security architecture could be built not just on military might, but on theological first principles?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Our sources for this deep dive lay out just such a vision. We're looking at a strategic blueprint for Ukraine's defense and security through 2030. And what's striking is that it's a plan explicitly rooted in Reformed theological principles. It aims to build a security architecture that is simultaneously militarily capable and morally proper. It's described by this really evocative metaphor, iron ramparts resting on gospel granite.
That's right, iron ramparts resting on gospel granite. It's an approach that tries to show how lethal capacity can be matched by moral clarity, tying military victory to societal renewal. So our aim today is to unpack this vision, drawing out the most vital points from the material we have. We'll consider how a nation might intentionally build its defenses on these deeply held spiritual convictions. We'll look at the doctrines that form its bedrock, the specific challenges Ukraine faced back in August 2025, the ambitious goals set for 2030, and the practical steps, the how-to for achieving them. And we'll also consider the potential risks and, the way these principles are intended to shape really every part of national life.
Sounds like a plan. It's quite a document. The core idea, iron ramparts, gospel granite.
Okay, let's start with the core idea, the central concept guiding this whole blueprint. As you said, this deep dive looks at Ukraine's post-war security blueprint, and it's strikingly different from conventional approaches.
Very different.
It's not just about technical solutions, it seems to be about, well, moral imagination.
That's a great way to put it. The core idea really centers on that metaphor, iron ramparts and gospel granite. The iron ramparts, they stand for the visible, the tangible aspects of military capabilities. So think cutting-edge air defense systems, digitized logistics, a well-trained military force. All that hardware and structure.
Just stuff you can see and measure.
Exactly. Those are the physical tools a nation uses to defend itself. But crucially, these ramparts, this strength, are meant to rest on gospel granite. And this gospel granite that represents the spiritual and theological foundations, the biblical principles that are supposed to guide every single facet of the security architecture.
Okay.
So this approach basically says national security isn't just a technical or military job. It's fundamentally a moral and theological enterprise. The ultimate aim is a system that's both militarily credible and morally proper, pursuing what the document calls a just peace.
A just peace.
Yeah, meaning that military strength should always be in the service of what is right and operating under divine oversight. It sets a very high bar. 2, the doctrinal foundations. 5 pillars of Reformed thought.
It certainly sounds like a fundamentally different way to think about national security. So if these principles are the bedrock, the gospel granite, what are these fundamental doctrines? What forms the intellectual foundation for, well, every policy proposal in this blueprint?
Right. The blueprint identifies 5 core Reformed doctrines that provide this framework. And it explicitly draws from sources like the Westminster Confession of Faith, various biblical texts, things like that, shaping how Ukraine approaches its security strategy.
Okay, 5 pillars. Let's walk through them.
First up is the absolute sovereignty and meticulous providence of God. This one's anchored in texts like Psalm 115.3, our God is in the heavens, he does all that he pleases, and the Westminster Confession, chapter 5, section 1. Basically, it holds that God guides all outcomes, everything.
Okay, that's foundational to Reformed thought, of course, but how does that translate into, say, defense policy?
Well, what's compelling here is how it reframes strategic planning. It means planning isn't this kind of anxious self-rescue, desperately trying to control every variable. Instead, it frames robust preparation budgeting, procuring weapons, training troops as an act of worshipful stewardship. You do your part diligently, but you trust that ultimate success rests with God.
Stewardship and trust.
Precisely. This perspective encourages a long-term outlook for reforms, fostering patience in pursuing them. Faithfulness is valued over maybe immediate, flashy results. It positions the government as accountable under God's sovereignty, not trying to somehow eclipse it or control everything itself.
That's a fascinating idea that meticulous planning can actually be an act of worship. It sounds like a really healthy balance, potentially. Doing your part, but acknowledging the outcome isn't solely in your hands.
It's a critical balance, yes.
Yeah.
The second pillar builds on this. The civil magistrate's mandate to bear the sword for good.
Romans 13 territory, right?
Exactly. Drawing from Romans 13.1-4 and the Westminster Confession, chapter 23, this doctrine states that the state's power, specifically its ability to use coercive force, is divinely granted. It's a delegated authority. And because it's delegated, it's limited. It's always answerable to God.
Okay, so the state has authority, but it's not absolute.
Not at all. This principle demands a defense posture marked by legitimacy. Forces must operate under proper authority with rules of engagement that are public, just, and transparent. And there need to be oversight bodies to investigate any misuse of that force. A professional, disciplined, accountable military signals that God's moral law is intended to govern even lethal force.
And the flip side?
The flip side is that things like irregular vengeance, corruption in the ranks or command, negligence, those aren't just failures of policy. They're seen as violations of this sacred trust granted by God.
That principle that even legitimate force is always under a higher law sounds powerful. But, how difficult is it in the fog of war, the heat of conflict, to actually ensure that limitation is observed? Does the blueprint address the practical challenges?
That's a vital question, and it leads directly into the third principle. Just war principles refined by the Reformed tradition. This isn't just abstract theory. It draws from a long line of thought: Augustine, Calvin, modern Reformed ethicists. It uses the familiar just war criteria. Things like just cause, legitimate authority, right intent, a reasonable hope of success, proportionality and discrimination, or non-combatant immunity.
The classic criteria.
Yes, but applied specifically through this Reformed lens. Policy-wise, these principles compel a deterrence-first posture. You acquire weapons primarily to forestall aggression, not to pursue vengeance or conquest. Proportionality dictates using precision systems to minimize collateral damage, hence the emphasis later on layered air and missile defense. Discrimination requires serious investment in ISR intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance.
The eyes and ears.
Right. To know who and what you're targeting. It also demands rigorous targeting protocols. The goal is to embed these principles so deeply into training syllabi and chaplaincy curricula that they become almost muscle memory for commanders and soldiers, safeguarding non-combatants even under pressure.
That makes sense, striving for precision, trying to lessen collateral damage.
Yeah.
How does the blueprint ensure that, military efficiency doesn't eventually override that moral clarity? It's a constant tension, isn't it?
It is, and it connects directly to the fourth doctrine, stewardship and the economy of common grace. This draws on texts like James 1:1, every good gift is from above, and Proverbs 21.5 on diligent planning. This doctrine teaches that all good gifts, and that includes technological advancements, scientific knowledge, resources, they all come from God, and they should be ethically harnessed for the common good, not just for private gain or military advantage alone.
So technology itself isn't neutral.
Not in this application. In this blueprint, Ukraine's defense industrial reform, for instance, is explicitly framed as covenantal stewardship. This means public funds must be managed transparently. Corruption isn't just bad policy, it's treated theologically as theft. Theft from God and the people. Competitive procurement processes have to reward excellence, not patronage or cronyism.
Okay, and how do they enforce that?
One practical application mentioned is using Nehemiah clauses, drawing inspiration from Nehemiah 5, where he refused the governor's food allowance and rebuked exploitation. These clauses would be built into contracts to ensure officials forego illicit gain, maybe allow for clawbacks if corruption is found. It reflects this core conviction that God ultimately owns the treasury and holds human stewards accountable. It's more than just fiscal tidiness, it's a theological statement.
Connecting financial integrity directly to spiritual discipline, wow, that's a strong claim. But it also sounds incredibly challenging, doesn't it? Especially in a wartime economy where the pressures are immense. How does the blueprint propose overcoming potentially entrenched corruption?
That is a critical challenge, absolutely. And it's tackled, in part, by the final doctrine, the fifth pillar, human dignity rooted in the imago Dei, the image of God.
Genesis 1.
Genesis 1.2628,
Okay.
exactly. This teaches that every single person, soldier, civilian, even an enemy prisoner of war, bears God's image and therefore possesses inherent worth and dignity. This conviction compels force planners to prioritize civilian protection. It demands humane detention policies. It underwrites the need for trauma-informed veteran care, seeing soldiers not just as assets but as souls.
Souls whose worth is measured at Calvary, as the document puts it.
Precisely. It also means defense policy has to extend beyond just kinetic actions to what they call comprehensive human flourishing. This means tangible mercy for vulnerable populations like widows and orphans affected by the conflict. It has to address reconciliation after the fighting stops. Crucially, this principle rejects any kind of cold utilitarian calculus that might sacrifice these populations for perceived military efficiency. Human dignity rooted in the Imago Dei is non-negotiable.
That principle, human dignity at the core, really broadens the scope of what national security even means. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on how that comprehensive human flourishing idea extends beyond just, say, immediate physical care for veterans?
Absolutely. It means looking at long-term psychological and spiritual well-being, economic reintegration, family support structures, ensuring that those who have sacrificed are truly cared for in a holistic way. It also informs the approach to reconciliation between different communities within Ukraine after the conflict. It's about restoring the whole person and the whole society in light of their God-given dignity.
Okay. So these five doctrines, sovereignty, magistrate, just war, stewardship, imago Dei, they collectively form the gospel granite, shaping this entire policy ecosystem.
That's the intention, yes. To ensure that the military hardware, the budgets, the alliances, the iron ramparts serve these higher moral and theological purposes. 3. The current state, where Ukraine stood in August 2025.
Okay, so with these deep principles laid out as the foundation, let's pivot to the practical reality. What was the situation on the ground when this blueprint was assessed in late 2025? What were the specific challenges and vulnerabilities Ukraine was facing then?
Right. The assessment from August 2025 paints a picture of Ukraine as, quote, weary but unbroken. They were entering their fourth autumn of full-scale war. The massive 1,000-kilometer front had largely stabilized into grinding positional battles, think World War I style, but with 21st century drones and precision strikes.
Real meat grinder.
Very much so. Russia was making small, costly gains in some areas, like near Shastyv Yar, while Ukraine kept pressure on Crimea and Russia's Black Sea Fleet. But neither side had the capacity for a decisive, large-scale maneuver. A major concern, though, was the surge in drone and missile strikes against targets deep inside Ukraine's cities, infrastructure. In June 2025 alone, Russia launched something like 5,438 Shahed-type drones and 239 cruise and ballistic missiles.
Wow, that's an incredible number. How are the defenses holding up?
They were struggling. Ukraine's air defenses were intercepting these at barely a 50% success rate. That was down from about 60% in early 2024.
A significant drop. Why was that?
Primarily due to dwindling interceptor stockpiles for advanced systems like Patriot and delays in Western aid deliveries. It showed a critical, very dangerous constraint in strategic air and missile defense.
That's a stark picture. What did that drop in intercept capability mean for military readiness more broadly?
Well, the report called strategic air and missile defense the harshest constraint. They only had 8 Patriot batteries operational across the whole country, and 2 of those were often down for maintenance.
Only 8. For a country that size.
Exactly. Commanders were forced into this constant shell defense game, shuttling the available batteries between major cities like Kyiv, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Odessa, trying to guess where the next major strike would hit. President Zelensky himself had stated publicly they needed at least 25 more Patriot-type systems to really blanket the country. So as it stood in late 2025, roughly a third of the population and most of the front lines were exposed.
That's incredibly vulnerable.
It forced difficult choices. They had to save their scarce Patriot missiles for the most dangerous threats, like ballistic missiles, and rely more on cheaper FPV drones, first-person view drones, and electronic warfare jamming against less sophisticated cruise missiles and drones. Manpower was also a factor. Newly formed brigades brought fresh soldiers, but the equipment pipelines, especially for things like 155mm artillery shells and armored recovery vehicles, were lagging behind mobilization rates.
And what about the stuff behind the front lines? Command and control, logistics, how are those systems functioning?
It was a mixed bag. The report praised the rapid field digitization, things like NATO-compatible radios, GIS-based targeting systems, and the Delta situational awareness software were widely used and effective at the tactical level.
So some definite progress there.
Yes, but at the brigade level and higher, logistics and medical evacuation remained, quote, partly analog. They were still heavily reliant on paper manifests, vulnerable Starlink hubs for communication. Fuel and ammunition supply lines were particularly vulnerable to attacks by Russian Lancet drones. And short-range airlift for case-evac casualty evacuation from the front was scarce. They only had about 6 Mi-8 helicopters dedicated to that critical role across the entire front. The assessment was clear. Without fully digitizing and hardening sustainment, even well-trained units would struggle with large-scale offensive maneuvers.
Right. The teeth are sharp, but the tail is weak, so to speak.
Something like that. And beyond the direct military picture, the civilian side was also under immense strain.
How is the civilian population holding up, especially critical infrastructure like the energy grid? We heard a lot about attacks on that.
Civil resilience, especially the energy grid, was severely impacted. The report estimated direct damage to the energy sector had hit U.S. $20 billion by August 2025. That was a 93% jump over the 2023 figure.
$20 billion, that's staggering.
It is. Russian strikes in the spring of 2025 had specifically targeted thermal power plants, destroying or disabling about 80% of that capacity. This led to widespread rolling blackouts across the country, forcing emergency electricity imports from the EU grid. And these blackouts had knock-on effects, disrupting not just daily life, but also defense industrial output, water pumping stations, and even rail logistics for moving heavy armor.
Right.
Despite heroic repair efforts, Russia's glide bomb campaign, using large bombs with wing kits, was reaching further inland, as far as Kremenchuk, keeping critical energy nodes under constant threat.
So a direct attack on the nation's ability to function.
Absolutely. And alongside the physical attacks, there was constant pressure in the digital realm.
Right, the cyber and hybrid threats. What was the situation there?
It was intense. In May 2025, there was a joint advisory from CISA, the U.S. Cybersecurity Agency, and multiple allies attributing a major espionage and sabotage campaign to Russian military intelligence, the GRU. Specific units like 26165, 2155 Fancy Bear, and 74455 Sandworm were named.
What were they targeting?
Western logistics firms handling aid shipments, and Ukrainian SCADA networks. Those are the industrial control systems for things like power grids and railways. Just a month later, the UK Foreign Office highlighted specific cyber attacks that had apparently mapped civilian shelters in Mariupol and Kharkiv prior to lethal strikes. They also warned of anticipated wiper malware waves designed to destroy data, potentially targeting rail infrastructure.
That's chillingly precise.
It is. And routine phishing attacks were constant, hitting regional energy companies, government ministries, even faith-based NGOs involved in relief work. While Ukraine's overall cyber resilience had improved partly thanks to migrating data to the cloud and better backups, the adversaries' hybrid tools were expanding, blending these cyber attacks with kinetic strikes and disinformation campaigns.
A multi-front assault. Finally, what about the human cost? The long-term societal effects that were becoming apparent by late 2025.
This was and remains a huge challenge. The Ministry of Veterans Affairs was projecting that up to 5 million Ukrainians, potentially a tenth of the entire nation, would hold veteran status by the war's end.
5 million.
An enormous number. And early field studies were already reporting very high rates of PTSD, depression, and moral injury among returning soldiers, potentially above 25% prevalence for PTSD. Ukraine's mental health system was chronically underfunded and simply overwhelmed. Struggling to meet this tidal wave of need, many veterans couldn't access the care they desperately needed.
A hidden wound of war.
A massive one. On top of that, you had around 6.2 million internally displaced persons, IDPs, straining municipal budgets and housing in safer regions. And the labor market faced a critical shortfall of skilled technicians, engineers, things like that, because so many had been mobilized or had fled. So the assessment concluded that militarily, Ukraine held combat-credible forces, but desperately needed strategic depth air defense and fully digitized logistics to regain initiative. Civically, resilience was remarkable yet vulnerable to blackouts, cyber disruptions, and the sheer weight of psychological trauma. It underscored the need for not just military solutions, but that spiritual component of rebuilding.
A sobering picture. It really sets the stage for why such an ambitious, principle-based plan was felt necessary.
Exactly. The moment called for, as the document says, sober use of lawful means, stewarding scarce resources, preserving life, restraining evil, all while planning for that eventual just peace. 4. Strategic objectives by 2030. The what?
Okay, so with those immense challenges from 2025 clearly understood, and with those 5 theological principles acting as the guide, what are the actual goals? What are the concrete, measurable objectives Ukraine set for itself by 2030 in this blueprint?
Right. The blueprint doesn't just stay theological. It translates those principles into 6 specific strategic objectives for 2030. These are framed as good works prepared beforehand, Ephesians 2.9 style, each with measurable targets and clear links back to the doctrinal foundations.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the first objective?
First, and absolutely critical given the 2025 situation, is achieving an 80% layered shield over the population. The target is clear. By December 31st, 2030, at least 80% of Ukraine's citizens must live under a multi-tier air and missile defense umbrella. And this shield needs to be effective, neutralizing ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and UAVs drones with an intercept success rate of 75% or better.
75%? That's a big jump from the 50% they had in 2025. How do they plan to get there?
Practically, it means fielding a lot more hardware. The goal is at least 32 Patriot or SAM-BT equivalent long-range batteries, integrating more medium-tier systems like NASAMS and IRIS-T, and absolutely saturating frontline cities and critical infrastructure with mobile CRAM systems, things like lasers and advanced jammers specifically for counter-UAV work. It also requires a distributed network-centric command structure, so the whole system isn't reliant on one single point of failure. Redundancy is key.
And the theological link.
This flows directly from the magistrate's Romans 13 mandate to defend the innocent, to protect the population under its care. And transparency is built in as an act of stewardship. They plan for semi-annual audits involving both the Rada, Ukraine's parliament, and NATO partners, plus an open online dashboard tracking progress.
Okay, a vital goal for protecting citizens, clearly linked to the state's God-given duty. What's next?
Second is achieving a digitized NATO interoperable force and sustainment chain. The target here is that by the fourth quarter of 2028, every single maneuver brigade must operate on a common digital backbone.
What does that entail?
Things like secure radios, GIS-based targeting systems, fully automated logistics manifests, even AI-assisted predictive maintenance for vehicles. And crucially, all of this has to be fully compatible with NATO's Federated Mission Networking Standards for seamless coalition operations. Operationally, the goal is a cloud-native joint logistics command to replace the old paper-bound depots. This should drastically shrink the time loops, sensitive shooter for targeting, and factory to foxhole for supplies from days down to hours. They're aiming for 95% of requisitions and medical evacuations to be processed electronically.
Again, efficiency seems key. How does that link theologically?
This is rooted squarely in reform stewardship. Wasted fuel, wasted ammunition, delays that cost soldiers lives. These are seen not just as inefficiency, but as a form of theft from the taxpayers who provide the resources and from the soldiers who bear the risk. The Ministry of Defense's Inspector General is tasked with verifying progress quarterly.
Efficiency and accountability as stewardship. Got it. What's the third objective?
Number 3 is to build a cyber fortress. Zero trust, 247 watchmen on the walls. By mid-2027, the goal is to field a National Security Operations Center, or SOC. This SOC would aggregate real-time threat data from military intelligence, energy sector monitors, telecom providers, everything into a single operational picture. Then, by 2029, all government ministries handling critical infrastructure data must adopt a zero-trust cybersecurity architecture.
Zero trust. What does that mean practically?
It means you don't automatically trust anyone or anything inside your network perimeter. It requires continuous authentication for users and devices, microsegmentation of networks so breaches can be contained, and applying the principle of least privilege access. People only get access to the data they absolutely need. The metrics for success are aggressive. Slash the average time it takes to detect a malicious intrusion to under 30 minutes to the average time to contain it to under 2 hours.
And the theological connection here, you mentioned watchmen.
Yes, inspired by Isaiah's watchmen. The theological basis is explicitly honoring the Imago Dei by safeguarding critical civilian infrastructure, hospitals, orphanages, power grids, water supplies, things people depend on for life and dignity. And again, oversight is key. The SOC reports to a civilian-led board, including representatives from the Reformed Chaplaincy Corps, to ensure state cyber power remains bounded and accountable.
Protecting digital infrastructure as an act of honoring human dignity, that's a really direct connection to their principles. Makes sense. Objective 4.
The fourth objective is an ethical defense industrial renaissance, aiming for a corruption index below 30. By 2030, the goal is for Ukraine's defense industry governance to score below 30 on Transparency International's specific Defense Corruption Risk Index. Achieving that would actually place it ahead of the current EU median score.
That's ambitious given the history and wartime pressures.
Key measures include processing at least 80% of defense contracts through the competitive Prozorro e-procurement system, which is already known for its transparency. Implementing those mandatory Nehemiah clauses in contracts, allowing for profit clawbacks if bribery or kickbacks are proven, and conducting rigorous triennial audits by an independent donor-funded inspectorate. The theological link is again biblical stewardship, with corruption explicitly seen as theft from God and the public. An ethical defense industry is seen as fulfilling a spiritual calling, turning assets meant for defense into instruments of common grace, not tools for private enrichment.
So financial integrity isn't just a nice to have, it's an operational objective with a clear target.
Very much so. The fifth objective is whole of society healing and resilience. This moves beyond hardware and systems to the human dimension. By 2030, the aim is to have treated at least 70% of veterans diagnosed with PTSD or related conditions.
70%, that's a huge number given the scale we discussed.
It is. It also includes providing full orphan support coverage for children of fallen soldiers and integrating every single oblast, every region, into cross-ethnic reconciliation programs that are explicitly grounded in gospel proclamation. Measurable outputs include things like funding 2,000 additional psychiatric beds, establishing 5 regional state-of-the-art prosthetic centers, and creating a nationwide network of reformed chaplaincy-run healing fellowships that combine professional trauma therapy with Christian discipleship.
And the theology.
This directly answers the Imago Dei imperative. It recognizes human souls as the ultimate objects of God's concern and legitimate state care. It consciously rejects any utilitarian view that might see these individuals, veterans, widows, orphans, as somehow less important than military efficiency.
It's a vision that clearly extends beyond just military victory to the long-term health and well-being of the entire nation, body and soul.
That's a key point, yes. And that leads to the final strategic objective, number 6, allied integration without idolatry.
The relationship with NATO and other partners. How is that framed?
By 2030, Ukraine aims to secure what the blueprint calls an Article 5 elite guarantee. This would cover, at minimum, air and missile defense integration and automatic support surges. They also aim for full participation in NATO's planning and review process, PARP, which aligns military structures. This integration is to be anchored by strong bilateral covenants, formal agreements with key allies like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Poland.
But didn't you mention a theological caution about alliances?
Absolutely. Reformed theology consistently warns against trusting in horses and chariots, as Psalm 20 says, or trusting in princes, from Psalm 146. Alliances are necessary means, but not ultimate saviors. So the ultimate metric here isn't just signing treaties, it's about Ukraine building its own demonstrated capacity and consciously treating alliances as providential gifts, not idols. They plan for annual parliamentary debates to review and renew these alliances, specifically to keep the nation's hope fixed on the Lord, not solely on foreign partners.
So it's about leveraging vital partnerships while maintaining a very clear theological perspective on where ultimate trust and reliance should rest. That's a delicate balance.
It's a very delicate balance. But these 6 objectives, taken together, represent the blueprint's attempt to translate doctrine into destiny, binding those iron ramparts to the gospel granite, ensuring legal capacity is matched by moral clarity, and linking military victory to lasting societal renewal. The 5 lines of effort, LOEs. The how.
Okay, those are some ambitious strategic objectives for 2030. But how do they actually plan to achieve them? What does this mean in terms of concrete actions? Our sources lay out 5 mutually reinforcing lines of effort LOEs that connect the doctrines directly to action, right?
That's right. These 5 lines of effort are the practical how-to for achieving those strategic objectives. They're the pathways, all explicitly rooted in that theological bedrock we've discussed.
Let's break them down. What's the first line of effort?
The first is LOE1 layered deterrence, which they nickname sword and trowel, drawing from Nehemiah building the wall while armed.
Sword and trowel, I like that. What's the aim?
The aim is straightforward. Create an interlocking shield of fire-air defense, coastal defense, border defense that makes renewed aggression prohibitively costly for any adversary. Basically, make Ukraine too tough a nut to crack. The tactics involve fusing those 30-plus Patriot or SAM-T batteries for the high-altitude threats, integrating NASAMS and IRIS-T for the medium tier, and then deploying mobile counter-UAV lasers and jammers right down to the point of contact defense. The goal is that 80% population coverage with a 75% or better intercept success rate we talked about, and critically, using a network-centric command architecture without a single crown jewel node ensures the shield can survive initial attacks and keep functioning. Resilience through distribution.
Makes sense. And the theological link for this LOE?
Deterrence itself is seen as defensive in spirit, aligning with the just war principle of right intent. Using precision systems embodies discrimination and proportionality. It's about the magistrate wielding the sword responsibly for the good, not for vengeance or aggression. And those semi-annual readiness audits, open to NATO and the Rada, signal doctrinal stewardship accountability and help deter complacency within their own forces.
So it's about being strong enough to prevent a fight, ideally, but doing it in a way that is ethically guided from the start.
That's the core idea. The second LOE complements this: covenant leadership and force culture.
Okay, what's the focus here?
The aim here is to cultivate an officer corps, and indeed the entire force culture, where people's reflexes, their habitual actions, are shaped as much by biblical teachings as by field manuals, helping ensure ethical conduct becomes second nature.
How do you cultivate that?
The methods involve reformed chaplains actively teaching in military academies, not just holding services, but teaching modules on just war checkpoints, the importance of Sabbath rest rhythms even in operations, and the practical demands of the Imago Dei for humane treatment of prisoners and civilians. Brigades are expected to conduct quarterly ethics exercises. These would combine live fire training with complex scenario-based rules of engagement drills, forcing commanders and troops to make difficult ethical decisions under pressure, reinforcing that union of skill and conscience.
So it's not just lectures, but practical application.
Exactly. The metric for success isn't just battlefield victories, but also seeing disciplinary incidents per 1,000 troops decline toward the EU median by 2030. This covenantal leadership is seen as crucial not only for curbing battlefield excesses, but also for building diplomatic trust with allies and facilitating that smooth allied integration they want.
That sounds like a deep effort to build military leadership based on character and moral reasoning, not just tactical proficiency.
It truly is. The third LOE broadens the scope beyond the professional military. Total defense mobilization.
Total defense, what does that look like?
The aim is to establish a comprehensive, maybe Switzerland-style, deterrent posture through broad societal engagement, getting everyone involved. Methods include creating reserve battalions tied to every oblast, every region, ensuring geographic coverage, scheduling regular biannual weekend drills for these reserves, and embedding practical civil defense curricula, first aid, shelter protocols dealing with disinformation into secondary schools.
So preparing the whole population.
Yes, and local churches are envisioned as playing a vital role here too, hosting first aid classes, running shelter drills, even organizing morale-building psalm sings during crises. The idea is to weld spiritual formation, building resilience through faith directly to practical preparedness. The targets are ambitious, achieving a 48-hour mobilization window for these reserves and getting 60% civilian participation in drills by 2028. This kind of distributed readiness massively complicates enemy planning and helps sustain public morale, especially during things like blackouts or cyber attacks.
And the theology behind this one.
It's inspired by Reformed theology's emphasis on household duty, citing 1 Timothy 5.8 about providing for one's own. National defense becomes a shared covenant responsibility, not just a job for a professional caste monopoly. Everyone has a role.
So the entire society becomes part of the defense posture,
Yeah.
building a really robust, deep level of resilience. That's quite a vision. What's LOE for?
LE4 brings us back to the money and industry, defense, industrial, and fiscal stewardship.
Right, tackling corruption and building an ethical industrial base.
Exactly. The aim is that ethical renaissance in defense procurement we talked about, driving down the corruption risk index below 30. The methods are practical. Push at least 80% of contracts through the transparent Prozorro e-marketplace. Mandate those Nehemiah clauses in public-private partnerships, requiring cost transparency and allowing profit clawbacks if corruption is proven. And establish that independent, donor-funded inspectorate to run triennial audits. This whole LOE is explicitly animated by Nehemiah's example of integrity in public finance when rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. It's framed as a crucial spiritual discipline for the nation, which they believe will also attract honest investment and accelerate the co-production of necessary defense components.
It seems they view good governance and financial integrity not just as ethical necessities, but as actual strategic assets.
We certainly do. And the final LOE, number 5, addresses the digital battlefield, cyber and hybrid watchmen on the walls.
Protecting critical infrastructure in cyberspace.
Precisely. The aim is to establish truly robust cyber defenses for all critical national infrastructure. The methods include getting that National Security Operations Center, SOC, fully operational by mid-2027, fusing all that telemetry data into a single 247 threat picture, mandating that every ministry handling critical infrastructure adopts zero-trust architecture and continuous authentication protocols by 2029. And the metrics are those tough targets. Reduce mean time to detect intrusions to under 30 minutes and mean time to contain them to under 2 hours.
And the theology, again drawing on Isaiah.
Yes, inspired by Isaiah 62.6, the watchmen who guard Jerusalem day and night, it honors the Imago Dei by safeguarding the essential services, hospitals, orphanages, power grids that people rely on. And that civilian-led oversight board, including reformed chaplains, is there to help ensure accountability and frustrate adversaries who might try to exploit state power. Cyber resilience is presented as both a spiritual duty and a technical mandate.
It's really clear from these lines of effort that this isn't just about military actions. It's about building or maybe rebuilding a nation from the ground up with these reformed principles woven into the very fabric.
Indeed. They aim to bring together military credibility, fiscal integrity, societal resilience, and spiritual vitality, ultimately seeking to make those iron ramparts into instruments of common grace. 6. Governance and oversight. Guardrails against idolatry.
Now, our sources talk quite a bit about the risks of unchecked authority, which is a constant theme in Reformed thought too, right? The danger of the state becoming an idol. So what specific mechanisms, what guardrails are built into this blueprint to ensure accountability and help prevent that?
That's a crucial aspect. Recognizing that power, especially state power involving lethal force, is a dangerous gift, and acknowledging the Reformed understanding of human depravity that even well-intentioned leaders could be tempted, the blueprint parades together several multi-layered guardrails. The aim is to distribute power, expose its exercise to light, both internally and externally, and constantly point ultimate trust back towards God, not the state itself or its allies.
Okay, what are these guardrails?
First, there's a strong emphasis on civilian supremacy in defense decision-making. While the Ukrainian constitution places the armed forces under presidential command, the blueprint seeks broader accountability. It proposes establishing a powerful, cross-party national security oversight committee within the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament. Modeled perhaps of the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, this body would hold regular quarterly hearings with full subpoena power, including access to classified annexes. The idea is to prevent the executive branch from hiding incompetence or misconduct behind secrecy.
So parliamentary oversight, what else?
In parallel, they propose an independent inspector general for defense, the IGD. This office would have the authority to conduct unannounced audits on anything from interceptor missile inventories to the treatment of prisoners of war. And importantly, it would publish redacted summaries of its findings within 60 days. This allows civilian journalists, NGOs, and the public to scrutinize the findings, helping ensure the military, quote, remains under the people's lawful stewardship, not above it. The National Cyber Center, the SOC, also reports to a civilian-led board with chaplain representation, guarding against mission creep and privacy abuses there too.
That sounds like robust checks and balances, definitely informed by a realistic, maybe even skeptical view of human nature and power.
It is. Next, there's judicial and ethical accountability for the warfighter. This addresses potential abuses within the military itself. While standard military courts would handle routine tactical offenses, the blueprint insists that strategic crimes, things like grand corruption and procurement, issuing clearly unlawful orders, or systemic breaches of international humanitarian law must be judged by civilian benches outside the military chain of command.
Taking it out of the military system.
For the most serious offenses, yes. It proposes a hybrid chamber within Ukraine's existing high anti-corruption court, specifically to hear defense-related graft cases, and a special prosecutor's office, advised by both Reformed ethicists and international legal experts, would be tasked with tracking command responsibility violations, holding commanders accountable for crimes committed by their subordinates if they knew or should have known. And the chaplains play a role here too, serving as moral sentinels embedded within units. They'd have a confidential channel to file memoranda if they witness abuse or serious ethical breaches, creating an early warning loop for the IGD's investigations. This is seen as fulfilling Romans 13 by ensuring the state is willing to turn the sword against its own misusers when necessary.
That sounds like a strong internal safeguard against abuse of power within the ranks. What about financial accountability?
That's the third guardrail. Financial transparency's covenant stewardship. This builds on those Nehemiah clauses and the ethical procurement goals we discussed earlier. The Ministry of Defense would be required to publish a detailed quarterly book of accounts. This wouldn't just be summaries. It would list all major contracts, say, above $50 million, their competitive status, was it tendered, and any cost variances. Alongside this, an open-source online dashboard updated maybe every 30 days would allow citizens, investors, and international donors to track spending and progress on key projects in near real time.
Making the data public.
Yes, and to prevent manipulation or cosmetic spin, the State Audit Service will be required to cross-post the raw financial data sets publicly as well. They also plan to strengthen whistleblower protections significantly, empowering logisticians or junior officers to expose fraud without fearing for their careers. The theological framing here is powerful. Financial transparency isn't just good economics. It's presented as an act of public worship, acknowledging that The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, as Psalm 24 says. Handling public money with integrity becomes a spiritual discipline.
So handling public money with integrity is framed as an act of worship itself. That's a really strong statement. What other guardrails are there?
A particularly interesting one is ecclesial accreditation of the chaplaincy corps. This addresses the potential risk of chaplains becoming mere extensions of state power or political tools.
How do they ensure their independence?
The blueprint proposes that chaplains must answer first to the church, then to the state. A national presbytery of military chaplains, drawn specifically from confessional reform denominations adhering to shared standards, would be responsible for examining candidates, testing their doctrine, character, and pastoral skills. This presbytery, not the military command, would grant and could also revoke chaplain licensure for things like doctrinal drift or moral misbehavior. This creates a vertical chain of holiness, ensuring chaplains are accountable to biblical standards first. This presbytery would also have the mandate to issue annual pastoral letters directly to the Rada, offering prophetic critique if they perceive national rhetoric becoming, say, overly xenophobic, triumphalist, or engaging in that alliance idolatry we discussed.
That's a fascinating layer of independent moral and spiritual oversight right within the system.
It certainly aims to be. It's designed to help ensure chaplains maintain their independence and their prophetic voice. Then, related to alliances, there's international and donor oversight without servility. While Ukraine actively seeks allied funding and support, Scripture warns against misplaced trust, right? Psalm 146, put not your trust in princes. So an international partners board involving NATO, the EU, major donors would receive regular quarterly briefings on progress and spending. But its role is clearly defined as diagnostic, not directive. They verify that funds match outputs and that corruption risks are trending downwards, but they don't dictate policy. And crucially, the Rada must annually debate and formally re-ratify each bilateral security agreement. This forces a public reaffirmation that alliances are providential gifts rather than ultimate saviors, guarding against both arrogant self-reliance, autarkic pride, and unhealthy dependence, client-state dependency.
So accepting help and partnerships, but consciously reaffirming that their ultimate hope remains fixed on God.
Precisely. And the final guardrail is perhaps the broadest: public catechesis and the habit of transparency. This is about cultivating an informed and discerning citizenry. The idea is for local congregations to host things like defense stewardship evenings, where church members can learn to understand the budget dashboards, discuss just war criteria, and grasp the spiritual stakes involved in national security policy. Making it accessible. Youth catechisms in churches would even include modules on things like lawful protest and conscientious objection, teaching the next generation that loyalty to Christ ultimately bounds loyalty to any earthly flag or state. This whole effort aims to foster discernment in ordinary citizens, enabling them to ask leaders tough, biblically informed questions. This informed public becomes a kind of second line of defense, woven not of iron, but of truth and accountability.
These mechanisms together paint a picture of a system deeply aware of the potential for power to corrupt, using both civic and spiritual checks to guard against it.
Yes. They clearly arise from the conviction that earthly authority is always alone, never in absolute possession, and the state is meant to be a minister under God, not a Messiah. 7. Alliance architecture. With whom and on what terms?
Okay, let's talk more about those alliances. This vision for security, rooted in Reformed principles, is clearly not isolationist. But how exactly does Ukraine envision structuring its alliances? How does it balance the obvious need for external support with those theological warnings against alliance idolatry?
That's a central tension the blueprint tries to navigate carefully. It lays out a three-tiered alliance structure, specifically designed to be, as they put it, sturdy enough to deter renewed aggression, yet loose enough to keep Ukraine's ultimate confidence fixed on the Lord. It's about leveraging external support as providential gifts while actively resisting the temptation to place ultimate trust in them.
3 tiers. What's the first tier?
The first tier is the NATO-anchored outer shield. Now, while full NATO membership remains the publicly declared long-term goal, the blueprint realistically acknowledges the political hurdles and timelines involved. So in the interim, it proposes seeking what it terms Article 5 late guarantees.
Article 5 late, what does that mean practically?
It means getting legally binding commitments from key NATO states specifically covering certain areas, primarily integrating Ukraine's air and missile defense systems directly into an allied command network, sharing real-time ISR data seamlessly, and, crucially, having pre-agreed Automatic allied logistics surges, like immediate resupply of interceptors or ammunition if Russia crosses certain defined escalation thresholds, perhaps like major ballistic missile strikes on Kyiv's central grid or attacks on NATO territory used for staving aid. These guarantees would be codified in something like an interim security umbrella treaty. Functionally, it aims to lift deterrence to an alliance level, even without the full procedural complexities of formal accession.
But how do they preserve Ukrainian sovereignty within that?
That's key. The blueprint insists that any foreign forces invited onto Ukrainian soil under such agreements would operate strictly at Kyiv's request, under clear status of forces agreements, good oversights. And importantly, operational command within Ukraine would remain entrusted to a Ukrainian four-star general. This is explicitly framed as safeguarding the magistrate's God-given Romans 13 mandate within Ukraine's national jurisdiction. No blank checks for foreign command.
Okay, so it's about gaining the protecting benefits of a powerful alliance network without formally ceding national command authority. It makes sense. What's the second tier?
The second tier consists of bilateral covenantal pacts. This is envisioned as a lattice, a network of tailored country-to-country treaties. These are deliberately framed in covenantal language, using terms that underscore mutual obligations, reciprocity, and shared purpose, going beyond purely transactional agreements. The idea is that these bilateral channels can often move faster and be more specific than large alliance bureaucracies like NATO or the EU.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. With the United States, they envision a 20-year arms and industrial reciprocity compact. Washington would guarantee priority access to key systems like Patriot missiles, HIMARS rockets, and advanced ISR drones. In return, Ukraine would open special tax-free industrial parks for joint U.S.-Ukrainian co-production of defense items, pledge rigorous end-use monitoring of weapons, and commit to maintaining that low corruption risk index we discussed. A joint ministerial review board would meet biannually, almost like Old Testament solemn assemblies, to audit compliance and reaffirm commitment. With the United Kingdom, they propose a maritime resilience treaty. This would pair Royal Navy advisors with Ukraine's recovering Black Sea fleet, potentially transfer surplus UK warships like Type 23 frigates for coastal missile defense, and grant joint access to undersea situational awareness cables in the Black Sea. In return, the UK might receive priority access to Ukrainian grain or critical minerals exports during international crises, reflecting that covenant reciprocity. For Poland, a crucial neighbor, a forward repair and reinforcement accord is suggested. This would formally position Polish heavy lift transport and rail capacity as Ukraine's strategic logistics backstop for major equipment repair and reinforcement. Warsaw, in turn, could gain preferential licensing for Ukrainian drone technology innovations, and both states would establish interlocking territorial defense drills, thickening NATO's eastern flank. And with the Baltic states and Finland, who share similar security concerns, a Northern Cyber and Air Domain Compact is proposed. This would formalize 247 data sharing between their national cyber centers, SOCs, and coordinate dispersed stockpiles of air defense interceptors, like for NASAM systems, enabling rapid cross-border reloads in a crisis. This pact also aims to foster deeper moral solidarity based on their shared historical experience under Russian pressure.
These sound like very practical, detailed, mutually beneficial agreements. Very specific.
They are intended to be. And notably, each bilateral covenant is designed to include a 7-year sunset and renewal clause. This mirrors the biblical concept of sabbatical cycles, forcing a periodic review and refreshing of consent, helping prevent these critical relationships from becoming stagnant or taken for granted.
Interesting. So NATO integration and these strong bilateral pacts, what's the third tier?
The third tier is perhaps the most unique, ecclesiastical diplomacy as moral glue.
Ecclesiastical diplomacy, what does that involve?
This proposes the formation of something like an evangelical fellowship for just peace in Eastern Europe. This wouldn't be a government body, but a fellowship composed of confessional Reformed and related evangelical churches in key partner nations: the United States, UK, Poland, the Nordic countries, perhaps others. Its mandate would be things like coordinated corporate prayer for peace and justice, exchanges of military chaplains, joint sponsorship of trauma care clinics in Ukraine, and publishing joint public statements reminding their respective governments of just war limits, the dignity of all people including enemies, and the duties of reconciliation after conflict.
So churches actively engaging in diplomacy.
In a moral and spiritual sense, yes. By remaining confessionally distinct, the blueprint specifically advises against vague ecumenical mergers that might dilute doctrine. This fellowship aims to amplify a clear prophetic witness on issues of war and peace within the allied nations. Pastoral exchanges between these churches are also seen as a way to humanize the conflict statistics, deepening political solidarity through shared faith and fellowship.
That's a really unique approach to international relations, trying to build spiritual and moral bridges alongside the political and military ones.
It is. It aims for a moral solidarity that undergirds and perhaps even corrects the political agreements. But across all three tiers, there's that constant, explicit focus on guarding against alliance idolatry.
How is that practically implemented?
The theological caution is clear. Reformed thought warns that alliances are means, not saviors, citing those Psalms again, 146.3, 20.7. So every treaty, bilateral or multilateral, is supposed to contain a preamble explicitly acknowledging divine sovereignty and grounding the partnership in shared moral purpose, not just strategic convenience. Those parliamentary accountability mechanisms, the annual debates, public scorecards on alliance performance are designed to keep the electorate alert to potential mission drift or over-reliance. And Ukraine's commitment to funding a minimum baseline of its own defense, a 2% of GDP target, regardless of external aid, signals self-reliance and helps ensure it's not simply outsourcing its national calling to foreign patrons.
What about managing inevitable friction between allies?
The blueprint suggests a permanent arbitration panel, maybe composed of 3 Ukrainian judges, 3 allied jurists, and 1 neutral chair, to adjudicate disputes quickly, within perhaps 90 days. And regular joint military exercises and war games are seen not just as training, but as relational oil, building trust and honing interoperability.
So it's a comprehensive approach. Build strong partnerships, but frame them theologically, hold them accountable, manage friction, and never let them become the ultimate object of national hope.
Exactly. The envisioned outcome is a security ecosystem where alliances function as vital providential instruments, indispensable for practical security, yet always penultimate, with the nation's ultimate hope consciously fixed on God, as reflected in King Asa's confession in 2 Chronicles 14 before battle. O Lord, there is none like you to help. 8. Care, reconciliation, and gospel witness, the soul of security.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the blueprint describes initiatives around care for veterans, widows, orphans, and reconciliation as the soul of security policy, not just add-ons or afterthoughts. Why is that framing used? Why is this considered the soul?
That framing is really intentional and points to perhaps the most distinct aspect of this entire blueprint. This comprehensive ministry of mercy, as they call it, is considered the soul because it directly addresses the deepest wounds of war on human beings, the physical, psychological, moral, and spiritual damage. It refuses to treat these issues as merely clinical problems or social welfare footnotes. Instead, it frames them as matters of profound spiritual and eternal consequence, flowing directly from the core doctrines, especially the Imago Dei. It aims to braid together spiritual care, psychological therapy, social justice, and economic reintegration into one seamless garment of gospel witness in action.
Okay, let's unpack the elements of this soul. How does it approach restoring the warrior?
The challenge here is staggering, as we noted. By 2030, potentially 5 million veterans, 10% of the nation, high PTSD rates, moral injury, grief, guilt, unanswered questions about meaning. The document calls this a pastoral emergency, because these are souls made in God's image who have witnessed and participated in terrible things, and the existing state mental health system is utterly insufficient.
So what's the proposed solution?
The proposal is ambitious. Every regional hospital should house an integrated Calvary clinic. This isn't just a name, it signals the approach. Trauma surgeons would literally share corridors with psychiatrists, professional biblical counselors, and specifically trained Reformed chaplains specializing in combat pastoral care. The funding model is hybrid. The state funds the buildings and professional salaries, while partner churches supply trained volunteer peer mentors, often veterans themselves, who can offer fellowship and understanding.
And the approach to care within these clinics?
It's holistic. Clinical protocols would absolutely use evidence-based therapies, things like EMDR, cognitive behavioral therapy, graded exposure therapy. But crucially, each therapy session is intended to begin with prayer and end with a benediction. This explicitly signals that ultimate healing flows not merely from medical or psychological interventions, vital as they are, but from a deeper spiritual source, from the grace found in Christ, the wounded yet risen Lamb who understands suffering. Warriors are treated not as broken machines to be fixed, but as souls whose worth is measured at Calvary.
That's a compelling vision, integrating professional care with explicit spiritual grounding, truly seeing the whole person.
Indeed. The second element is sheltering widows, orphans, and the maimed. This flows directly from those biblical mandates in James 1.27 about pure religion visiting orphans and widows, and Isaiah 58 rebuking religious observance that ignores the suffering poor.
How is this put into practice?
On a national level, They propose establishing a dedicated Onesimus Fund, named after the Apostle Paul's appeal for the runaway slave to provide indexed pensions, school stipends, and property tax relief specifically for the families of fallen soldiers. Financial security is foundational, but the blueprint stresses that true mercy requires proximity, not just bureaucratic wire transfers. So local congregations are strongly encouraged to actively adopt blocks or groups of war widows and orphans in their communities. Church deacons would be expected to visit monthly, helping with practical needs like home repairs, offering companionship, maybe reading to fatherless children, real community care.
And for those with physical injuries.
For the maimed, particularly amputees, the plan includes establishing those regional prosthetic centers. But it also proposes that each church presbytery, a regional body of churches, operate a mobile prosthetics bus. These buses, staffed by orthotists and occupational therapists, would tour rural oblasts, bringing advanced fitting and therapy services to those who can't easily travel. And touchingly, the bus windows are envisioned to carry the verse, Psalm 147.3. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds, making every bandage, every prosthetic fitting, a visible sign of covenant compassion. Where does the funding for all this come from? Interestingly, the blueprint suggests funding the Onesimus Fund and these initiatives partly from a dedicated ties on defense export royalties. If Ukraine successfully builds its defense industry and exports technology, a portion of those profits would be automatically channeled into caring for more victims. This intentionally connects the sword's profits to the balm of Gilead, demonstrating that biblical stewardship, not just sentimentality, drives this charity.
So it's not just about financial aid, but about genuine, proximate community care, funded in a way that reflects their values. What's the third aspect of this soul?
The third aspect is knitting estranged communities. This tackles the deep societal divisions that war often exacerbates, in which Russia, in particular, has actively sought to weaponize divisions based on language, Ukrainian versus Russian speakers, ethnicity, Tatars, Jews, Hungarians, Roma, Poles, or political history. The theological conviction here is that the gospel itself tears down these dividing walls of hostility, as Ephesians 2 puts it, creating one new humanity in Christ.
How did they propose to foster that reconciliation practically?
Through a National Reconciliation Commission. This would be co-chaired significantly by leaders representing different communities, perhaps a Reformed theologian, an Orthodox bishop loyal to Kiev, and a respected Crimean Tatar mufti. This commission would conduct regional truth-telling hearings across the country. Victims would have a platform to recount atrocities they suffered. Perpetrators of lesser abuses might confess publicly. Historians would provide context and verify claims.
Similar to truth commissions elsewhere, but with a specific theological framing.
Yes, distinctively so. Unlike purely secular restorative justice models, these hearings are envisioned to culminate not just in testimony, but in public readings of Scripture relevant to confession and forgiveness, corporate prayers confessing national and communal sins, and formal declarations of forgiveness explicitly grounded in Christ's substitutionary satisfaction on the cross. The outcomes would aim for both grace and justice. Things like restitution agreements for victims, community service orders for offenders, but also formal referrals to civilian courts for crimes that exceed any potential amnesty thresholds. It upholds accountability while centering forgiveness in the work of Christ.
What about cultural initiatives?
They also suggest things like mixed choir festivals, featuring music from different traditions, and bilingual Psalter publishing projects, inviting citizens to experience reconciliation actively through shared art and worship.
This speaks to healing very deep societal divisions, going way beyond just individual trauma therapy.
Exactly. It recognizes that national security ultimately depends on internal cohesion, which they believe is best fostered through this gospel-centered reconciliation process. Then finally, there's embedding gospel witness in national life. This is about ensuring these efforts aren't just short-term programs, but become part of the enduring fabric of society.
How is that achieved?
Through things like including invitations and military discharge packets for veterans to join transition home groups. These groups, hosted by local churches, wouldn't just be support groups. They'd specifically study biblical principles, maybe looking at the Westminster Shorter Catechism Q&A 26 on Christ's threefold office as prophet, priest, and king, and discuss how to apply those truths to daily life, family, work, and civic duty as they reintegrate. In public schools, especially in liberated towns, they propose a weekly Stories of Courage Hour, where students interview local veterans and war widows, fostering empathy and gratitude in the next generation, pushing back against potential cynicism or forgetfulness. And even national ceremonies, like the annual Day of Remembrance for Fallen Soldiers, would intentionally combine traditional military elements, like a solemn flyover, with congregational singing of a specific psalm, like Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength, liturgically uniting state ceremony and covenant worship without improperly merging their distinct spheres.
So it's about integrating faith, healing, and remembrance into the very rhythm and fabric of national life.
It truly is. And like the other objectives, there are clear metrics and accountability proposed for these sole initiatives. By 2030, the targets include treating 70% of diagnosed PTSD cases, ensuring every oblast has at least one prosthetics hub per million residents, and placing 95% of war orphans in stable kinship or church-sponsored foster care, aiming to avoid relying on state orphanages. Progress would be tracked on a joint public dashboard run by the Ministries of Health and Veterans Affairs, and church presbyteries would be expected to audit the church-run programs, reporting their findings directly to the Verkhovna Rada, citing 2 Corinthians 8.21 about being honorable not just in God's sight but also in the sight of others. So you see why they call these ministries the soul of the policy. They're not optional extras. They're presented as the very heart of what security is ultimately for. A nation that actively binds its wounded, protects its widows, reconciles its enemies internally, that nation, the blueprint argues, displays a kind of cruciform wisdom. It's learning to turn swords into plowshares, spiritually and socially, even while keeping its spears ready to guard the harvest physically. True victory, in this view, isn't just repelling invaders, it's seeing lives and communities restored by grace. 5 and I, risk matrix and mitigation.
That's a powerful vision for the soul of security. But of course, no grand plan, especially one this ambitious and principle-driven, is without significant risks and potential challenges. What does the blueprint identify as the gravest threats that could potentially derail this whole project? And what are the covenantal countermeasures designed to mitigate them?
Yes, the blueprint includes a dedicated section on risks, reflecting that reformed emphasis on sober vigilance and acknowledging human limitations and sinfulness. It identifies 6 primary risks and outlines specific mitigation strategies, often grounding these countermeasures in the same theological principles that shape the objectives.
Okay, what's the first major risk they anticipate?
The first one is almost inevitable: corruption backlash. The very reforms designed to clean up defense procurement and contracting the competitive e-tenders, the Nehemiah clauses, the independent audits, directly threaten deeply entrenched patronage networks and vested interests. The risk is that officials benefiting from the old system might actively sabotage the new e-platforms, leak damaging disinformation to discredit reformers, or simply exploit legitimate wartime secrecy exemptions to continue hiding kickbacks and illicit deals.
How do they propose to counter that?
Through a combination of structural sunlight and moral chastening. Structurally, that quarterly book of accounts we talked about is key. It must publish raw contract data in machine-readable formats. Why? So that independent civic tech watchdogs and investigative journalists can easily download it, analyze it, and crowdsource the detection of anomalies or suspicious patterns. The idea is, every time the public spots a red flag before the official auditors do, the reputational cost of graft rises. Morally, the chaplaincy corps and reformed pulpits across the country are tasked with consistently preaching that bribery and corruption in public office are not just crimes, but serious sins, theft from God and neighbor, a form of sacrilege. They should invoke texts like Proverbs 11.1, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, until the electorate itself comes to view corruption as a kind of covenant treachery, a betrayal of public trust under God. And if domestic measures fail, the blueprint suggests Kiev could, as a last resort, invite international co-prosecutors to handle high-value defense corruption cases, signaling that absolutely no official is above the law.
So it's about shining a bright light on corruption from multiple angles: public data, civic watchdogs, moral preaching, and potentially international justice. Makes sense. What's the second risk?
The second major risk is donor fatigue and alliance friction. Let's face it, a multi-year, high-intensity war puts enormous strain on Western treasuries and political patience. If elections in key partner capitals bring isolationist or fiscally constrained governments to power, the pipelines of munitions, funding, and technology could slow down or even dry up, potentially leaving Ukraine vulnerable just as its layered shield is half-built.
A very real concern. What's the mitigation strategy here?
It's threefold: evidence, rhythm, and reciprocity. Evidence means that public dashboard tracking progress must be rigorously maintained and actively promoted. It needs to translate aid delivered into clear, measurable battlefield and humanitarian outcomes, things like intercept percentages achieved, kilometers of power lines repaired, number of PTSD beds opened. Foreign taxpayers need to see tangible results for their investment. Rhythm refers to those regular biannual joint capability reviews with donors and allies. These aren't just technical meetings. They're crucial for maintaining trust, managing expectations, allowing for budget reprofiling before frustrations fester into major disagreements. Reciprocity emphasizes those bilateral pacts offering tangible benefits back to partners like priority grain shipments, shared access to technology patents, intelligence sharing. It makes the partnership feel mutually beneficial, not just like charity. And critically underpinning all this is Ukraine's own commitment to spend that minimum 2% of its GDP on defense, regardless of external funding levels, signaling self-financed resolve and shared burden.
It's about actively demonstrating value, maintaining open communication, ensuring mutual benefit, and showing self-reliance to sustain those vital partnerships. Got it. Third risk.
The third risk is the ever-present danger of escalation with Russia. As Ukraine's defensive capabilities grow stronger, particularly its air defense network and potential deep strike denial systems, Moscow might feel cornered and resort to horizontal escalation.
What does that mean?
It means striking targets outside of Ukraine proper. Things like hitting NATO staging grounds in Poland or Romania where aid flows through, launching major cyber sabotage attacks against Western critical infrastructure, or even covert attacks on Ukrainian diplomats or facilities abroad, trying to widen the conflict or intimidate Ukraine's backers.
A dangerous possibility. How do they plan to mitigate that?
Through multi-layered deterrence. Every significant deployment of advanced Western systems like Patriot or long-range missiles, ATAC-CMS if provided, needs to be accompanied by a clear, public, just war rationale emphasizing its defensive purpose. Simultaneously, maintaining private, reliable deconfliction channels with Russia is crucial to avoid miscalculation. That interim security umbrella treaty with NATO allies needs to codify clear red lines and automatic allied logistical surges if Russia crosses them, making the cost of escalation predictable and high for Moscow. Distributing command nodes and key assets helps ensure that even a successful Russian strike cannot decapitate Ukraine's defense. And interestingly, that ecclesial diplomacy channel is also seen as a potential, albeit narrow, door for exploring repentance and negotiated de-escalation, constantly reminding policymakers on both sides that ultimate vengeance belongs to God, not to earthly powers.
So a combination of military strength, clear communication, allied solidarity, and even a potential faith channel for de-escalation. Complex. What's risk number 4?
Risk number 4 is internal. Domestic polarization and moral exhaustion. Years of grinding conflict, mounting casualty lists, economic hardship, and constant blackouts inevitably erode social cohesion. There's a real danger that political entrepreneurs, perhaps even fueled by foreign disinformation, could exploit this fatigue, pitting regions against regions, language groups against language groups, or war-weary civilians against the military.
How can that be countered?
Mitigation here needs to happen at multiple levels, starting at the pulpit and the public podium. Those National Reconciliation Commission hearings need to be televised, held in every oblast, allowing victims' voices to be heard and perpetrators of lesser crimes to confess publicly under the shadow of the cross. This aims to lance boils of resentment before demagogues can weaponize them. Those monthly stories of courage assemblies in schools are designed to humanize the war's cost for the next generation, inoculating them against cynical apathy or historical revisionism. Politically, maintaining low proportional representation thresholds for parliamentary elections helps ensure that minority voices and regional concerns have a pathway into lawful debate, rather than festering into street protests or separatism. And spiritually, pastors are called upon to consistently preach the gospel message that Christ has broken down the dividing wall of hostility, Ephesians 2, directly confronting ethno-national pride or regional chauvinism with the call to gospel humility and unity in Christ.
A truly comprehensive approach trying to strengthen the social fabric from multiple angles: truth-telling, education, political inclusion, and spiritual formation. What's the 5th risk?
The 5th is technical but potentially catastrophic: cyber cascade failure. The nightmare scenario is a single, sophisticated, well-timed wiper malware attack, perhaps combined with physical sabotage that simultaneously cripples power grids, hospital data systems, banking networks, and military logistics communications. A digital Pearl Harbor.
How do you mitigate something like that?
While the Zero Trust architecture and the 247 National SOC are designed to drastically cut detection and containment times for cyber intrusions, the blueprint acknowledges that perfect digital defense is impossible. Therefore, resilience also requires what it calls analog ballast. This means deliberately maintaining offline backups and procedures, printed field manuals for soldiers, paper medical records and clinics as a fallback, having diesel backup generators for critical command posts and depots, keeping pre-printed targeting maps and artillery firing tables. Theological realism, they argue, demands redundancy like Noah building the ark with multiple levels. They even propose annual cyber Sabbath drills, where entire sectors, maybe transportation or energy, have to operate for 24 hours on deliberately degraded digital capacity, relying on these analog backups. This forces them to identify hidden choke points and single points of failure before an enemy exploits them.
Preparing for the worst-case digital scenario by maintaining non-digital backups and practicing operating without full connectivity. Very prudent. And the final risk.
The final risk identified is internal to the religious aspect itself, theological drift and chaplain capture. As Ukraine integrates more closely with allies, especially diverse, pluralistic Western nations, and as the chaplaincy corps gains influence, there's a risk. The temptation might arise for chaplains to dilute distinctively Reformed or evangelical doctrines in favor of a more generic, vaguely defined civil religion, palatable to everyone, thereby losing their specific theological grounding and prophetic edge. They could become, essentially, state-sponsored morale officers rather than ministers of the gospel.
How is that risk addressed?
Primarily through strengthening the independence and accountability of the chaplaincy corps itself. Those triennial licensure reviews conducted by the National Presbytery, not the military, are crucial. They must examine chaplains on both doctrine and practice, with the power to suspend licenses for heresy or moral scandal. Encouraging joint ethics seminars between Ukrainian Reformed chaplains and their counterparts from allied nations is seen as a way to promote iron-sharpening iron collegiality, while consciously preserving confessional boundaries and distinctives. And ultimately, the blueprint states that if the state ever attempts to script chaplain sermons, dictate theological content, or misuse chaplains for purely political ends, the participating churches must be prepared to exercise the law of God rather than men, citing Acts 5.29, even if it means withdrawing their personnel rather than compromising core doctrines or endorsing state error. The church's loyalty is to Christ first.
So, protecting the theological integrity and independence of their spiritual guides is seen as a key defense for the health of the nation and the blueprint itself.
Absolutely. These 6 risks and their mitigation strategies form a kind of secondary shield, a lattice of light, law, and liturgy, as the document puts it. It's a sober acknowledgement that strategy, no matter how well conceived, is not self-executing. Only constant repentance, rigorous oversight, and sustained communal vigilance under God can keep the whole ambitious plan on track. X timeline and milestones, the path to 2030.
Okay, this is clearly a hugely ambitious multi-year plan. It stretches years into the future from that 2025 assessment point. Let's look at the concrete roadmap. How did they envision this unfolding? What were the key milestones marking the path, the pilgrimage, as they might call it, from the improvisation of wartime towards this envisioned covenant-shaped security order by 2030?
Right. The blueprint doesn't just offer principles and goals. It lays out a detailed narrative itinerary, a phased timeline with specific milestones. It's divided into 6 calendrical stages, showing the intended progression from the difficult situation in 2025 towards that fortified and hopefully reconciled Ukraine of 2030, aiming to maintain both strategic momentum and that spiritual focus throughout.
Let's walk through these stages. What was stage 1?
Stage 1, clearing the rubble, July-December 2025. This initial 6-month phase focused on laying critical foundations, often amidst ongoing fighting. Key events included mid-2025. The Verkhovna Rada successfully passed the crucial Defense Integrity Act, mandating competitive e-procurement through Prozorro and establishing that Independent Inspector General for Defense, IGD, getting the anti-corruption machinery in place early. August 2025. A tangible sign of progress, the first Patriot PAC-3 missiles, financed by a Dutch PRL tranche, pay upfront revolving loan, arrived at Boryspil Airport near Kyiv. Joint Ukrainian-Dutch crews immediately began integration and shakedown firings. October 2025. That public book of accounts financial transparency dashboard went live online, starting to shed light on defense contracts. And by December 31st, 2025, a milestone, the first fully operational Patriot battery, given the call sign Nehemiah 1, for its focus on rebuilding defenses with integrity, was declared combat ready, providing initial protection for Kyiv. This marked about 5% national air defense coverage achieved. Small, but a start.
Okay, so clearing rubble, laying foundations, getting the first advanced systems online. What came next in stage 2?
Stage 2, wiring the nerves. January-June 2026. This period focused on building the connective tissue training, oversight, initial care systems, and expanding basic defense coverage. Highlights included January 2026, a week-long multinational Patriot live-fire exercise held at the Yavoriv training ground, building interoperability. February 2026. Military academies formally adopted the revised curriculum, which integrated those ethics seminars led by reformed chaplains into officer training. March 2026. Civilian oversight kicked in, as the RADA's new National Security Oversight Committee, NSOC, held its first classified hearing, scrutinizing defense plans. April 2026. The pilot Calvary Clinic for Integrated PTSD Care opened its doors in Lviv, testing the model combining spiritual counsel with evidence-based therapy. May 2026. A significant cyber milestone, Ukraine's National Security Operations Center, codenamed Watchman, went fully live, fusing threat telemetry and aiming to meet that target of reducing mean time to detect intrusions significantly, under 40 minutes initially. And by June 30, 2026, tangible progress on the Shield, 2 additional Patriot batteries plus an IRIS-T medium-range platoon became operational, raising the population air defense coverage estimate to around 20%.
So wiring the system, starting the healing process, expanding the shield. What about stage 3?
Stage 3, muscles and breath, July 2026, December 2027. This longer 18-month window aimed to expand both kinetic reach, the military muscle, and institutional breadth across society. Key developments. July 2026. The first of those crucial biannual joint capability reviews was held with NATO and key bilateral partners, assessing progress and coordinating future aid. November 2026. The Forward Repair and Reinforcement Accord with Poland fully activated its cross-border heavy lift rail corridor, vital for logistics. March 2027. A boost for naval defense, the arrival of the first of 2 promised Type 23 frigates transferred under the UK Maritime Resilience Treaty, enhancing Black Sea coastal defense. September 2027. A societal milestone, 60% of secondary school seniors completed certified civil defense drills, contributing to the goal of cutting national mobilization time down to 48 hours. December 2027. The pilot project for the digitized command and control and logistics system conducted its first major live exercise, dubbed Psalm 144 Shield, referencing the psalm about God training hands for war, coordinating fires, and evac digitally. By the end of 2027, the blueprint projected air defense coverage reaching 60%, and the Defense Corruption Risk Index dropping below 45, showing real progress on both fronts.
Significant gains in capability and governance. Stage 4.
Stage 4, Forging the Spine, January-December 2028. This year focused on consolidating earlier gains and hardening the core systems. Milestones included January 2028. The second national cycle of those Stories of Courage school assemblies began, embedding remembrance and resilience. April 2028. All designated critical infrastructure ministries completed their rollouts of zero-trust cyber architecture, significantly improving average breach containment times, aiming for under 90 minutes. June 2028. Marked the first 7-year Sabato-style renewal point for those bilateral covenants. The U.S. Arms Reciprocity Compact was extended, explicitly conditional on Ukraine's corruption index dropping below 35, linking aid to reform. August 2028. The first joint Ukrainian-Baltic NASAMS air defense reload drill took place, practicing cross-border interoperability. October 15, 2028. A decisive logistical milestone, the new Joint Logistics Command declared full operational capability, digitally tracking supplies from factory to foxhole. By the end of 2028, population air defense coverage was targeted to touch 70%. 35% of diagnosed veterans were projected to be receiving PTSD treatment through the expanding Calvary Clinic network. And every oblast was planned to host at least one functioning prosthetics hub. The spine was strengthening.
Getting closer to those 2030 goals. What happened in Stage 5?
Stage 5. Saturation and Sabbath cycle renewal, January-December 2029. This stage aimed for comprehensive coverage in key areas and embedding cycles of self-review and improvement. Key events. February 2029. The National Reconciliation Commission commenced its sensitive but crucial regional televised truth-telling hearings. April 2029. The independent IGD published its second triennial audit report, expected to show a substantial 2/3 reduction in procurement irregularities compared to the 2025 baseline. Evidence of reform taking hold. July 2029. 3 more Patriot batteries and new point defense laser systems became operational, pushing the air defense shield's intercept capacity beyond the 75% effectiveness target. Autumn 2029. The first annual Cyber Sabbath shutdown drill was conducted, testing those analog backup systems under realistic stress. December 2029. The third joint capability review with partners was slated to formally certify Ukraine's logistics, command and control, and cyber posture as fully NATO interoperable in all major mission areas, potentially removing the last technical barriers for future membership debates.
Almost there. What does the final stage 6, look like?
Stage 6, Covenant Completion, January-June 2030. This final 6-month period focused on reaching the finish line for the core 2030 objectives and marking the transition. January 2030. A major governance win, the IGD was projected to announce that Ukraine's defense corruption index had officially fallen to 28, below the target of 30, triggering potential donor bonus tranches for things like veteran housing. February 2030. A pastoral milestone, every combat brigade now fielded a fully licensed reformed chaplain, and military disciplinary incidents had dropped by a targeted 40% since 2025, indicating a shift in force culture. March 2030. The final planned Patriot Battery, symbolically named Balm of Gilead, became operational near Odessa, pushing the vital air defense coverage past the 80% threshold nationwide. April 20 to 2030, Easter Sunday, a national Thanksgiving service was planned, intentionally uniting state officials and church leaders in gratitude, perhaps centered around Psalm 46. And finally, June 30 to 2030. The Verkhovna Rada was scheduled to publish a formal white paper declaring that, based on audited data, all 5 strategic lines of effort had met or surpassed their targets. This would symbolically close the loop, marking the intended completion of this phase of building security on a foundation of both iron ramparts and gospel granite.
That's an incredibly detailed and ambitious timeline, weaving together military hardware, institutional reform, societal healing, and spiritual discipline year by year. Outro. So what does this all really mean? We've spent this time looking at a truly extraordinary blueprint, one that aims to rebuild Ukraine's security, not just with, military precision, but with a deep moral clarity. It's a comprehensive vision that genuinely tries to connect those visible iron ramparts with the deeper gospel granite of its theological convictions.
It really is a remarkable attempt at what the document calls a covenantal synthesis. It tries to ensure that military ability, the iron, is continually guided and checked by moral purpose and accountability to God, the granite. The envisioned outcome by 2030 isn't just a strong military, but a fortified commonwealth capable of deterring aggression without becoming a mirror image of the aggressor.
A nation strong, yet penitent, vigilant, yet merciful.
That's the aspiration woven throughout, yes. A nation that understands its strength comes with responsibility, rooted in something beyond itself.
It's a compelling idea, isn't it? That a nation's very security architecture, the way it defends itself, the way it treats its people, could actually bear witness to something beyond its own strength or its alliances. It kind of leaves us with that provocative thought from Zechariah, doesn't it? That true, lasting security, in the end, flows not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord Almighty.
That's right. The blueprint fundamentally suggests that it's this gospel granite, this foundation of faith and principle, that can ultimately bear the nation's full weight through the trials of war and the challenges of peace until, as they would understand it, a greater king returns to establish perfect justice and lasting peace.
A challenging and thought-provoking perspective indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Reformed thinking. We trust this discussion is giving you much to consider. Until next time.